What does it actually take to lose body fat?
Well, I think the science is pretty clear. The consensus amongst the domain specific professionals is consistent. I think that in executing those principles is where we fail. So I think it's 1% information and 99% implementation. You've heard me say compliance is the science. So we'll probably spend the bulk of our time talking about the information just to lay it out for folks. But that's not where ultimately the long term success lies. The long term success lies in adherence, being able to implement the plan and stick with it long term. And we'll talk about ways to do that. First of all, it is an energy balance equation. Some people oversimplify it by calling it calories in, calories out, and then demonizing a comparison between cookies and carrots. But those are all straw man arguments. You definitely, on both sides of the energy balance of equation, need to ultimately create a calorie deficit if you want to lose weight. And I think that's the focus of this question in particular. And of course, there's some people who don't want to lose weight. And I should say lose fat, to correctly address it, because we'll talk about the importance of retaining lean mass. So that's kind of where it starts, is that it's total daily energy intake. That's all the calories you consume. And total daily energy expenditure. That's all the calories you burn. And there's multiple ways in which you expend energy as well. But how you do that can dramatically influence whether you're losing fat or muscle, whether you can adhere to the diet. Your satiety is a part of that equation based on what you eat and how you expend energy. And the healthfulness of the diet, whether or not you are providing yourself sufficient micronutrients. So calories are king is kind of how I lead. I usually try and find out about how many calories somebody's currently consuming, or use one of those calculators on the internet, the Mifflin St. Jeor equation, or many of the others, to calculate what your daily maintenance calories are. And then if you have a weight loss goal, we've got to somehow create a deficit either on the energy intake or energy expenditure side, and ideally both working together. So that's where it starts. And then I quickly move to macronutrients, and I try and prioritize protein for a number of reasons. It provides a satiety benefit. It's the macronutrient that seems to keep you full the longest, that and fiber. It will support the retention of lean mass. And it has what's called a higher thermic effect of food, which has, on the energy expenditure side of the equation, a benefit whereby when you consume 100 calories of protein, you net out about 70 to 75 because of the thermic effect. You burn calories digesting protein more than you would for fats or carbs. And so protein has those three very obvious benefits. And so I start there. And from what the literature suggests, for the typical person that's not significantly overweight, about zero point 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. And that can vary based on if you're a real lean individual or if you have a lot of excess body fat. But that's a good marker that will maximize your muscle protein synthesis, your stimulation of muscle. I might go a little higher if I want to increase the satiety effect. And I might go a little lower for people who want to gain weight and I'm trying to decrease satiety. But generally speaking, that's a good range. What they'd say 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's going to put us in about 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And that's a generalization, again, because somebody who's significantly overweight, they wouldn't need 0.8 grams. They might use lean weight. They might try and figure out, or goal weight, in order to calculate their protein intake. And then after that, we've got carbs and fats. You need a minimum amount of fats in order to help with sleep and hormone regulation and fat-soluble vitamin absorption. And there's been some research on this. It varies, I think, based on size, but a minimum of around 50 to 60 grams of fats a day in order to accomplish those goals. And then beyond that, where you put your percentage of fats and carbohydrate intake doesn't seem to matter for weight loss. It does matter for performance, and that might only affect a top, few percentage of people. And so it's really personal preference at that point. You prefer more fats or more carbs? There may be a downside to the types of fats that you consume in terms of people's susceptibility to cardiovascular disease, LDL, ApoB elevation, in which case you want to be cognizant of the amount of saturated fat that you consume, because it can, for some people, not everyone, but for some people, can elevate their LDL, which is one contributing factor towards cardiovascular disease. So that might be one consideration in the types of fats. And so I'd like to keep at least a significant amount of monounsaturates, omega-3s, salmon, avocado, olive oil in there. And then some folks may have to limit the amount of cholesterol they consume. About 20% of the population are hyperabsorbers, and they can actually increase their LDL cholesterol from dietary cholesterol. The vast majority of people do not, in which case, eggs are fine for most people. And the only way to tell these things is to get a blood test. I don't mean to get too deep into these specifics, but I think it's important to distinguish. We're talking about, ultimately the health of the diet. And then there should be some diversity from a variety of different whole foods, whole foods being better than ultra processed, hyper palatable foods in terms of satiety and maintenance in terms of total calories that you eat and limiting hunger. But the variety helps with a host of things, obviously getting more micronutrients from a variety of foods. And so my proteins would generally be across a wide swath. I use lean meats, could be chicken, lean steak like top sirloin. I love salmon, the omega-3 benefits, eggs, whole eggs in particular. I do like the yolk, the biotin, the choline involved in that, and dairy for those people who aren't allergic or maybe be specific as to the amount that they can tolerate if they have some degree of lactose intolerance. But dairy has an independent effect on BMI, as Stu Phillips has recently written about, and the American Heart Association has published. So I do include dairy primarily for calcium, but the yogurt in particular, the fermented dairy, the Stanford trials, the Sonnenbergs found that 100% of participants who consumed fermented foods improved their gut microbiome, as opposed to only 30% improving with the fiber arm of the experiment. So I definitely try and include some Greek yogurt, maybe some kefir, those kinds of things. But see, it's a broad range of proteins. I don't overemphasize any one in particular, but I like to get a sufficient amount. And the reason for the red meat, particularly for women, is the iron intake. I find that women, especially those who exercise or are chronically dieting, end up suffering from anemia. And those who compete, whether it's distance sports or figure physique bikini, end up with the female triad. And ultimately, the cessation of the menstrual period, amenorrhea. And so those kinds of things I try and mitigate through diet, of course. And that's your calories and your macronutrients, focusing on protein first, and then finding a balance of carbohydrates and fats that fit your personal preference, and then addressing getting sufficient micronutrients. One of the keys to micronutrients, I think, we talked about a little bit about iron. We talked a little bit about calcium. I think one that I lead with for carbohydrates in particular is I like to start with the foundation of high potassium rich carbohydrates. It's kind of hard to get 4,700 milligrams of potassium a day, and it has a host of benefits, including blood pressure regulation and heart arrhythmia and blood sugar regulation, water regulation. Some people suffer from bouts of edema. Potassium is very helpful for balancing water in the body. You got to be deliberate. It's hard to get those. There's about 1,000 milligrams of potassium in a potato, so twice that of a banana. And then there's citrus fruits. Oranges are great for that. And there's plenty of potassium in yogurt. And there's also potassium in meat, about 100 milligrams per ounce of meat. So you kind of cobble together a host of variety of sources that are high potassium sources to build up your foundation of carbohydrates before you throw in any additional carbohydrates for performance for those people who have to support a significant amount of body mass or a high workload. I think that kind of wraps up the big rocks for breaking down a diet from calories to macronutrients to micronutrients.